Hello and welcome back to a new episode of On Leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I'm your host each week. This podcast is sponsored by Franklin Covey, the world's most trusted leadership organization, now for 6 years and nearly 400 episodes. We release episodes on Tuesdays and Fridays, both in audio and video formats, where we try to make you a better leader. We interview business titans, CEOs, thought leaders, best-selling authors, celebrities, actors, researchers, scientists, solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, people who have lived through and survived unspeakable tragedies, that have summoned the courage and perseverance to teach you the lessons that they have learned from it. All this is to pour into you as a better leader, however you choose to define that role in your life. Perhaps you are a formal leader of an organization. Maybe you are a mid or senior level manager, or perhaps you're a first-time leader on the front line. Maybe you're not employed, and maybe you are in a leadership position in a not-for-profit or in your home as the primary provider or caretaker. Whatever it is, Franklin Covey is dedicated to helping you live out and maximize your own great purposes. Today we have a little bit different kind of interview because typically we speak to leadership, business, marketing, branding, communication experts. Today we're interviewing a CIA agent, a former spy, if you will, that has written this remarkable book called Breaking Cover. The tagline is My Secret Life in the CIA and What It Taught Me About What's Worth Fighting For. Joining us from her home in Florida is Michele Rigby Assad. Michele, welcome to On Leadership.
Thanks so much, Scott. Really happy to be here.
Now, I told you off air that I read about 125 books a year for this podcast, plus some pleasure reading, and the other books that I read for the 2 additional podcasts that I host. And typically I read a book for about a week prior to a podcast. I have 4 or 5 in the queue at any given time. Not a good idea. Don't try that. And typically about 9:30 at night, my wife will come upstairs and say, hey, so how was the book? And I'll sometimes say, it's great, or I'm struggling to find the point of view in this. And then sometimes I'll say, you know what? I'm really enjoying this. And about a week ago, that was my response when she asked me about your book. And she said, that's the kind of book I would like. I said, you know what? After the podcast, the book is yours. So you've got 2 fans, one current and one brewing in the Miller household. I'd love to stop there and maybe have you rewind, because how you became a member of the CIA is a fascinating trail. I actually think it's a great story in serendipity and perseverance and open to opportunities, because it wasn't like your life's goal to become a CIA agent, although you mastered that and have served democracy well. Will you take a few minutes and talk about high school and college, your first entree into the CIA, and then no thank you, and then your second entree back in, because you wrote a great book that I think people will devour after listening to this podcast. Reorient us to your journey.
Thank you so much, Scott. I love that introduction. I'm very honored by your words. Indeed, I never imagined working for the CIA. It wasn't a dream I had growing up, because I didn't even know that was an actual real job. I come from a very small town in Florida, a place with a lot of orange groves and pastures, and didn't know anything about the world, didn't have any connections to government or government service. However, a few days after I graduated high school, I went on a mission trip to Egypt with a group of students. And so this kind of busted open my world. You go from small town USA to Egypt to volunteer in an orphanage. And it was a very, very life-changing trip. So I got bit by the travel bug and went on another mission trip a year later to Russia and Ukraine, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was fascinating. I did another semester abroad as a junior in Cairo. Then I really started learning the Middle East politics, culture, more about the people, started to learn Arabic. And then after graduating college, all the way through college, I thought I was going to be a pharmacist. And then after these trips, I was like, no. There's something else for me. I don't know what it is, but it has to do something with travel. So got married, moved to Washington, D.C., and could not shake this weird feeling, this like gut instinct that I was supposed to really get to know the Middle East, study, travel, do whatever I could. So I started teaching myself Arabic. I got some workbooks. I started taking night classes. One thing led to another, and I decided to get my master's degree in Arab studies at Georgetown University, right in DC. And as I was applying to all sorts of jobs, not knowing, again, what I wanted to do, had no idea where I would end up, I ended up getting contacted by only one organization, and that was the CIA, and started going through the process of getting into the agency. It was a very, I know I love people who are really into leadership and personal development. You always want to know how someone gets from point A to point B. Well, for me, nothing's ever straight and nothing's ever easy. So as I was going through the process, I was hired to become an analyst in the CIA. And right after I graduated Georgetown and was going to start that job, the job was rescinded from me for reasons I had no idea. And then it was maybe a year and a half later, my husband and I started learning about this whole other side of the CIA that's my husband said is the quote cool side. They're the ones that do, they're the ones that do the spying overseas. And I didn't think I was CIA material. I couldn't imagine doing that kind of a job, but surprise, surprise, both my husband and I got in. And as my husband started training and as I was being processed to begin, 9/11 occurred. So suffice it to say, it was probably the most interesting, obviously difficult time to become a counterterrorism officer in the CIA, but that's what we did for the next 10 years.
And your book is a riveting story of sort of how this unassuming small town American woman, which is an important point, right?
Yes.
Became this remarkably valuable asset to our nation and our allies' national security. I mean, the book is a thriller in many ways in terms of learning your stories, but you've written it first person, and so you've written in this way of how you kind of can't believe you found yourself in these situations. You earned your way there. You open the book with a very tender story about the fragility that Iraqis were going through when they were petitioning to flee the country, and the role that you and your husband had as interviewers to determine who was legitimately at risk of death and who was perhaps an ISIS operative that was just faking their way out in the hopes to do something else. Will you kind of share that story? And you kind of have a couple of stories happening at the same time in terms of who do you think is lying and who do you think is not lying, and you had this massive responsibility to make judgment calls on literally the future of their life and their family. Recreate one of those so people can understand the level of responsibility, but the level of training you have to employ to make not just judgment calls on their life, but judgment calls on whatever country they go back to and where they may foment and lie dormant for years and years. It's a remarkable tale.
Indeed. When we started thinking about leaving the CIA after being in for 10 years, it was very scary because we had had so much purpose, felt so much purpose, and had done such meaningful things like every single day for 10 years. We were worried about not having any purpose and meaning on the outside. Well, that was thrown out the window with this incredible project that dropped in our laps, wherein we were asked to join an informal group of people who were trying to rescue persecuted Iraqi Christians from northern Iraq who had been ejected or forced out of their ancestral homeland. And they were in another part of Iraq. And so we were brought in to try to figure out if there was anything we could do to help these people. Can we use our diplomatic skills to maybe find a receiving country? Can we get all of our ducks in a row and get all their paperwork together? Because we didn't want to pitch to take a group of people at a time when the world was overrun with refugees. So this was 2015. So it was the year in which Europe was literally being overrun on the sea border and land border. Everyone had, it sounds crazy, but refugees coming out of their ears, like they just couldn't accommodate everyone who was coming in. Much like we're experiencing now in the United States. But so if we're going to pitch some country to take these people, then we have to be able to say, we vetted them, we debrief them, we talk to them face to face, and we collect their documentation, and none of them pose a risk to you. So to be able to say that, we really did have to get in front of around 500 people, 500 Iraqis that were living in a camp in the Kurdish area of Iraq. And it was incredible then to be able to use this strange set of skills that we developed working in the CIA. We are experts on vetting people. Like, that's the job, is being able to know who's lying, who's telling you the truth. You watch their body language, you watch how they're interacting with you, you pay attention to what they say, what they avoid saying, how maybe if they deflect what you're trying to get at. So there's all these techniques that we learned very well, which we used in that moment in time to prepare a group of people to be accepted by a new country. And so that project was really felt like the culmination of so many years of skill building in the CIA, but to do it in support of people seeking human rights and safety and security, that felt really good. I mean, that's an understatement. It was amazing.
Again, your book reads like an absolute thriller, even though sometimes you were just doing, kind of non-thriller things. I mean, you were, just, interviewing people and making these life or death judgment calls. You shared one story in particular, I believe, about a gentleman, maybe it was his wife or girlfriend, that had mentioned that he had I think his mom was a Christian, claimed his mom was a Christian, and that he had to end up selling his kidney to fund the ransom money for her release. And you found that to be a little bit over the top. Maybe that's not the right story to tell, but would you just dive into a story so that the listeners and viewers today can understand the level of skill that you and your husband and other agents developed to really vet what made sense and what didn't, and what skills did you use to get to, hopefully, the truth to make decisions on whether they would or would not be offered life outside of the country?
Sure. So there was one particular family we had vetted. I think they probably had 7 members of their family. And then they came to us after the interview and said, our daughter has a fiance that wants to come also to this new country that hopefully you're going to find for us to take us in. Would you mind meeting with him and vetting him as well so he can be part of this group? So we said, sure, of course, we'd be happy to. And so it was a very strange interview. So we now have literally hundreds of interviews under our belt with this particular people group. So when you do that, you start to develop, or you really develop, a baseline for what a legitimate story sounds like, and when someone is not telling you the truth or they're holding something back. And so we had this catalog of stories that we have heard over and over and over again. We sat with this, when this guy walked into the room, just when he approached, I could tell that something was wrong. His body language was off. And, but you think, okay, let's wait, let's see what he says. So we start talking, and he claims to be a convert from Islam to Christianity. And so everyone else up until this point that we'd interviewed were Christians. So that's interesting, because if he's a real convert, then his life really is in danger in that part of the world, i.e. you could be tortured or killed for leaving Islam. So that piqued our interest. So tell us more about that. Tell us about your conversion. Well, it was a very short conversion story. And he ended up saying, well, one day I just woke up, and even though I always respected Jesus as a prophet, I decided that I would just become a Christian. Now, when you're interviewing people, in the best situation, you have substance matter expertise. We have subject matter expertise that makes you substantive in these things. And we happen to know a lot of converts. And so one thing that really stood out, a huge red flag: nobody just wakes up one morning and decides to risk their life and change their religion because they just, the sun hit the horizon in just the right way. Like, when you change your religion, or if you just even leave Islam, it comes after so much soul searching, because you just realize you're putting it all on the line. And this guy was talking about it like he just decided what cereal to eat that morning. And then, so my husband and I kept, we both look at each other like we both know this guy is totally lying, but let's push it further. And so we know that the difference between Muslims and Christians is that Christians see Jesus as their savior, as God incarnate. That's the big difference. Muslims respect him, but see him as a prophet. So we ended up saying, you know, what do you think of Jesus and what he did on the cross for you? And so when we asked that question, he looked at us funny, like cocked his head, like, what does it mean? What do you mean that you want me to talk about what he did on the cross? And then we said, what does the blood of Jesus mean to you? Because to Christians, this is like a key part of the redemption story. And he literally pushed back in his chair, like trying to get away from us. And everything inside him kind of like froze. And then his eyes glazed over and got strangely dark. And both Joseph and I thought it looked as if he maybe had a spirit or something. It was very strange, but the idea of who Jesus was so rattled him and what the blood of Jesus was. So if you're a subject matter expert, you know that this reaction is the wrong reaction. You are not a convert to Christianity. So that might be a funny example to use, but it was so extreme. His behavior was off the charts, indicating that he was lying, that he was trying to be something that he really wasn't. And so we were like, either this guy is trying to just get to a new country, or he may have other plans as a potential terrorist. And we didn't know at that point, but obviously we did not consider him to move to a new country.
To be clear to our listeners, you weren't trying to advocate one religion or another. You had become an expert on what it meant to be a Christian. It's like you could have been an expert on Hinduism or Taoism or something else. Right.
Absolutely, yeah. But in that moment, you're just trying to see whether that story makes sense. Does it fit? Is this person telling the truth? And our knowledge, of that particular religion helped us to understand that he didn't know what he was claiming.
Right. Can you share with us what happened then? Was he denied? Was his quote fiance, who I think was the daughter, was she denied? What happened to that group and its expansion or contraction and their exit out of that country?
So that gentleman we then regarded as a potential threat to the group because we didn't know who he was attached to. And quite honestly, we didn't have the time to delve into it. Like I would have loved to do that. I love that kind of thing, but we had bigger things to do. So we basically reported him to authorities and sat the family down and said, this man is a danger to your daughter and a danger to your family, and you need to cut ties with him. So the family did exactly that. We put them on the list. They were placed onto the list of people to, get out of Iraq. That other gentleman, his information we passed to local authorities.
Got it. Let's talk about one of many interrogations you conducted. And I believe the gentleman's name was Abu Muhammad. I use the word gentleman loosely, independent of his, through no correlation to his religion, but to his activity. You share a lot of interrogations. This one was interesting in terms of how you conducted yourself as a white female American interrogator. Lots of things went into that. I'm guessing your book has been vetted by the CIA. I guess it had to be
absolutely
approved.
Yes,
so anything you discuss today is open forum. Will you walk us through, and don't gloss over it, walk us through some of the engagements you had with him in terms of just how you entered the room, what kind of eye contact, this physical space, how you understood what he was going to try to extract from you, maybe give some backstory on his story, why he was in custody, and talk about some of the things you learned from that.
Sure. So to give some context to that story, I was debriefing a mid-level terrorist he was a member of the second largest terror group in Iraq. And he was the kind, you always have to really know where these guys are coming from if you're going to interact well with them. So he was not an ideologue. He was like the guy that, broke people's legs or, killed them, or he was like a soldier, a foot soldier. And he was kind of a scary presence. Like he had big muscles. He was stocky. He just, walked into a room and filled it up. Very full of pride, very arrogant. which is always fun to deal with. I mean, really super fun to like try to break that down. But a good debriefer or interrogator understands how they come off to the other person. So you're going to be received in a particular way. And so me walking in the room, you know, I was fairly young at that point, obviously female, American, CIA, and it's assumed I'm Christian, whether that's correct or not, doesn't matter in his mind, you know. So I'm all these categories of people that he hates and that his ideology says you shouldn't interact with these people. And now I'm trying to get this guy to spill the beans on the most sensitive intelligence that only a few people have access to. So this is a huge gulf that I need to cross in order to connect with him and get this intel. But it's not just the questions you ask, but as you referred to in the way you've set this up, the question, it's how you interact with them non-verbally that also sets the stage for whether you're going to be successful or not. So as you're walking in the room, I'm thinking about, I'm cataloging everything he's doing. He's cataloging my behavior. I know he's street smart. He doesn't know that I know how to read nonverbals well. But everything matters, like how close I stand to him, you know, how much eye contact there is. Like too much eye contact and he thinks he's going to think I'm flirting with him. Too little eye contact and I'm either fearful or aloof. If I stand too closely, again, he's going to think I'm, in that particular culture, he's going to think I'm flirting. If I stand too far away, again, disconnected. When I shake his hand, I don't want a coldfish handshake. You know, I have to be, forceful grip, good grip. But also I need to pull my hand out of his grip because otherwise these guys, they're not supposed to be in a room with women that they're not married to or not part of their family. So, but it's super exciting if they can be. So of course they want to hold on to your hand and touch it and caress you. So you literally have to pull your hand out of their grip. So everything that you do in this interaction with this terrorist matters. And so even those silly things like eye contact and where you stand and how you sit and how you engage with someone, it matters to them. And I'm assessing him and he's assessing me at the same time.
I mean, and story after story after story of I use the word riveting because that's what you've written. That's the style in which you've written it. What would you like the leaders, the entrepreneurs, individual contributors that are listening today to learn about some of the things you've mastered about human dynamics, independent of maybe what country you come from, or your religion, or your ideology, or how you've been inculcated in a certain political philosophy? What are some governing principles that govern people's behavior that you've learned that people might say, that's interesting, I should employ that or be more aware of that over your training?
Well, I believe that for most of your audience who are interested in how to be a good leader, but also how to be a good human being and how to interact well with others, whether you're managing your household or managing a team of people, empathy is incredibly important to make a connection with the people that you are in charge of, that you're managing. And I think Americans tend to confuse empathy with agreement. They are not the same things. Empathy literally means that you can figure out where another person is coming from. So I always tell people it's not a mystery to me why terrorists believe what they believe, because I've read the ideology and I understand where it comes from. I understand what's going on in their minds. Understanding and agreement, again, very different things. But as a leader, if you can't empathize, if you don't have discernment where a person, who they are, number one, and what they're dealing with, what are their strengths, what are their challenges, you can't put them in the right positions. You can't manage them well. You can't interact with them in a way that, is good for both parties. You have to be able to, so for instance, I was so misjudged by HR in the agency. I was so misjudged by my own management who never thought I had the chops to do these debriefings. And it's because they just, kind of looked at the package and thought they'll never respect her. And so part of one of the huge lessons that I learned is that you have to get past the package. You have to get past the appearance. What is the skill set there? I had the first, 4.5 years I was in the agency, I didn't even have managers who asked me that question. They didn't know that I had worked so hard to understand terror ideology. They didn't know I'd been traveling to the Middle East for years. They didn't know I had been all kinds of places in the world, before the age of 25. They didn't know all of these things. So you can't know what people are good at unless you get past the package, you have empathy to see where they're coming from, and you actually communicate with them.
Michele, was there a time in your service where you were fearful for your life, you were fearful of being exposed? When you maybe share something so people can appreciate the risk that people like yourself go through and place yourself and your families in for the protection of freedom and democracy in America. And again, I mentioned our allies.
Yeah, so when we were doing that last project, which was after we left the CIA, helping these Iraqis find a safe haven in another country, Joseph and I, my husband, we were both in the agency together, realized that one of the biggest risks for us at that point was there were a lot of Iranians in Iraq, and we knew that they were running around Kurdistan as well as Baghdad and all the other big cities in Iraq. And we also knew that because we'd served in the CIA, that our names had made a list. It had been put onto a list of people to be targeted by IRGC Quds Force, so the Iranian intelligence operational agencies that assassinate people. And so our biggest concern wasn't necessarily ISIS, which was only about 40 miles away where we were, like the front lines. I mean, I suppose that was enough to be concerned with, but more concerning to us was the fact that we had to be careful just walking down the street because a car could pull up, somebody could grab you, throw you in the trunk, and then drive over the border into Iran, and you'll never be heard from again. So it's really important to understand the safety risks and be aware of your environment no matter where you are, because obviously by dropping cover, writing a book, speaking professionally and all of these things, there still exists a risk to doing that in my life.
Michele, although you are American, you married an Egyptian, which is why your last name is Assad. Is there anything that you've learned from your many decades of studying life in the Middle East and the Muslim culture, the Islamic faith, that you think maybe non-Muslims might benefit from knowing? Because I think there are a lot of people that have suffered at the hands of Islamic extremists and tend to probably naively and wrongly lump all members of the Islamic faith into a prejudiced category, which of course is ridiculous, doing that with any religion or society or nationality. Is there anything you would share as an expert on that area of the world, even though you are American, that you'd like people to maybe just think of it this way, or be careful not to lump these things together?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard when you don't travel to that part of the world. America is so far away from the rest of the world. It's very expensive for us to get abroad. It's very hard to travel. So people don't tend to have a lot of experience in the Middle East. Well, what you don't know is how very different each country is from the next. I mean, my goodness, Egypt is totally different from Saudi, which is different from Lebanon, from Tunisia. They're all vastly different cultures. And then even within each country, you've got, in Egypt per se, you've got Southern Egypt, Upper Egypt, which has a very different culture than, say, Cairo or Alexandria. And so what you have to do is, again, not judge people by their package, by their exterior, just, think a particular thing because maybe they look different than us. It's that there's so much variation in experience, education, thought, ideology. I was always surprised by, even in places where there was a high degree of security risk, I lived in a lot of tribal locations where if you're taken in by a tribe, it doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, it's their responsibility to keep you safe. If you're a visitor or a guest, like that's an amazing thing. I learned a lot about hospitality from my time in the Middle East, and that that is true no matter where you find yourself in the Middle East. Middle Easterners are incredibly hospitable, giving people. And in the areas where we have political differences, it's because, you know, we have different filters, we have different things. And so you just have to learn to talk to people in a more like open and elicitation, ask questions. You know, everyone loves to answer questions about themselves. And sorry if I could throw this in, Americans are so scared to ask simple questions of Middle Easterners. Like, where are you from? What was your growing up life like? Middle Easterners like us love to answer that question. I've talked to people like, yeah, I have a friend from the Middle East. And then I say, where's your friend from? And they're like, I have no idea. I'm like, you never ask them? Like, you know, ask them for stories about growing up, get to know people on a personal level. There's nothing that's going to offend them when you ask those questions.
Michele, I think it's a sad state that confidence in U.S. institutions is probably at an all-time low, right? The political discourse in our country is lamentable at best. You have members running for president that constantly disparage parts of our armed forces and the work of the FBI and the CIA. And of course, I'm not naive to believe that, you know, everything those institutions are doing is noble and legal and right and such. What would you say, as a former CIA operative and as a person who's written a book and a citizen of the world, what would you say about your experience with the CIA and generally your concern or appreciation for where they are going and what their mission is?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, no matter what's going on in the world, you still have a lot of people out there working for the CIA, working for the FBI, working for law enforcement, that no matter what's going on in DC politically, they're out, you know, on the streets, doing the hard job, risking their lives. And so I always want to say, you know, be grateful for all of your fellow citizens who are, you know, spending nights away from their families trying to protect this country. At the same time, I hold the same concern that a lot of Americans have right now. A lot of our agencies are becoming very politicized by their leadership. And we obviously deserve better as a country. I always say my husband and I served under both administrations, Republican and Democrat, and we were proud to do so both times or every time. And I mean, those are the kinds of people we do need working in government who are just there to serve and protect. So yeah, it is a tough time for us. I won't pretend it's not, that's for sure.
Why did you write this book?
Well, I am very cheesy. I truly wrote this book because I thought I learned some lessons that I think others are going to be so interested to hear that's going to directly apply to their life. So maybe I was in the CIA, maybe I was a counterterrorism officer serving in the Middle East, which seems to most people like such a wacky thing. But the things I learned, the lessons I learned are so applicable to life, like getting over imposter syndrome. My gosh, try going from a small town in Florida into the CIA. Like I had massive imposter syndrome. Being misjudged and having to work really hard in order to get my CIA leadership to acknowledge my skill set and then place me in roles that played to that leadership. That was a huge lesson. Another one would be do hard things, like go to places other people don't want to go to. Get it out of your comfort zone. Stretch yourself, because if I hadn't done that, if I hadn't gone to war zones, if I hadn't served in really dangerous locations, I would not have developed the level of counterterrorism and counterintelligence expertise that I now hold. Like you can't get that serving in the most luxurious places in the world. You really have to go to the place where the war has exploded. But in your own life, if I could extrapolate that, it's like, what are you doing right now to challenge yourself? If you're not a little bit challenged, if you're not a little bit scared, you're not trying hard enough. So I wrote this book because I really felt like I wanted to inspire other people. It wasn't a resume builder. It wasn't like an ego project. It truly was to just pass it on.
I'm not going to ask you to opine on what's happening specifically right now between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, although we read about it by the hour, right? I mean, it's just an unspeakable tragedy what is happening on all sides. And you can talk to a Palestinian and have enormous empathy for their plight. You can talk to an Israeli and have enormous empathy for their plight. But generally, I mean, it's a tinderbox. If you actually follow what's going on in Syria, still in Lebanon, and in Jordan, and what's happening with the unrest that's happened in Egypt, seems calmer now, but what's happening in this humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza right now with the unspeakable carnage that was inflicted on the Israelis with the Hamas attack. Generally speaking, are you encouraged? Are you horrified about the future? We're all horrified about the current situation.
I'm all the above.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm all the above. So I think that it's unfortunate that our news doesn't tell us, some of the interesting things that are going on in places that would be really helpful for us to know as we're trying to understand the region. I'll give you an example. So you've got Iran's using the Yemeni Houthis to send cruise missiles and another weaponry against Israel. And so that shut off shipping in the Suez Canal. And that's Egypt's largest income is from the Suez. And so one of the massive effects is that Egypt's economy is in a terrible state right now. And when you have 100 million people in Egypt, the economy matters very, very much. So one of the, well, I can't say unintended consequences because I do believe they wanted to stop the shipping, but that Egypt is suffering. So there's a lot of suffering going on in other places that is directly impacted by what I believe has been directed by Iran from the beginning.
Well, and it was only going to take one, Hutu missile to hit an American ship in the Gulf.
Sure.
And
right.
we knock how many of these drones out of the sky on a daily basis, but it's only going to take one to hit. When I would think,
and you've got a place like Saudi Arabia that has been holding incredible international events. They've been inviting people from all over the world to see, the new Saudi Arabia and what they're trying to achieve with their visioning. I mean, one errant missile landing either off the coast of Saudi or near Saudi airspace or in it would be very bad for Saudi Arabia. So, what you don't see, people are so scared the tinderbox is going to go up. But I would just say most of the Middle East, most of the Arabs understand even better than we do what's at stake here, which is really, Iran is very, very dangerous. And we haven't responded appropriately to that threat as a group.
Not to mention the perceived alliance that's developing between the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans, and to the extent China is involved in that as well. It's just, if people don't think that's something
they
to be
take advantage of the chaos, right?
Yeah,
so actors like
of course they do.
Putin
and also keep America busy, keep America preoccupied, keep America distracted as we build, our alliance. I appreciate you joining us today. This could have been a 4-hour interview on all things Middle East. Your book is captivating. It reads like a thriller, but it's real life and true because the CIA, I'm sure, had to vet every word you wrote in this book. Michele Rigby Assad, your book is called Breaking Cover, My Secret Life in the CIA and What It Taught Me About What's Worth Fighting For. You'll have to read the book to understand what's worth fighting for. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Scott.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.